Welcome to today's virtual In Focus lecture. For those of you not familiar with In Focus, this is a series that we put on that shows, it kind of lifts the veil, shows a little bit more behind the scenes. We can dive deeper into our exhibitions. We can highlight projects our staff is working on that might not make it to an exhibition. So be on the lookout. Our next In Focus is on March 7th with our curator, Todd Gustafson, in the technology department. So check out eastman.org to learn more about that. But for today, here at the Eastman, we are celebrating our 75th anniversary this year, and we're featuring exhibitions that highlight a wide range of holdings from the museum collection. After opening its doors to the public in 1949, the George Eastman Museum quickly became known as one of the most important venues dedicated to the collection and care of photographs. At the time of its opening, it was one of only 2 American museums to establish a photography department. And this early commitment to the medium has inextricably bound the institution to the history of photography itself. The exhibition, Life with Photographs, 75 Years of the Eastman Museum, explores the many ways in which photographic objects have come to shape our everyday lives. The exhibition encompasses broad cultural histories and image-making practices, from pre-photographic experimentation to critical advances that challenge our conceptions of the medium. While the objects on view highlight certain strengths in the museum's holding, lesser-known works are included to illuminate unexpected pathways into this rich and diverse collection. Today, you're going to hear from Jamie M. Allen, the Stephen B. and Janice G. Ashley curator and head of the Department of Photography. She will discuss how the exhibition was conceived, co-curated, and designed, while also taking a look at some of the significant works in this exhibition. If you yourself find yourself in Rochester, I invite you to come visit this exhibition. It will be on view in our main galleries until August 31st of this year. I want to express gratitude and appreciation to our sponsors for this exhibition. Major support for the 75th anniversary exhibitions is provided by the Rubens Family Foundation and generously sponsored by the Midtown Athletic Club, St. John's, and Leading Edge Advising and Development. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get going. If you have questions during the presentation, please drop them in the Q&A function. This should be at the top or bottom of your screen, depending what device you're using today. The chat is also open, as you might see. People have dropped in their location. If you'd like to share, feel free to hop in there. But for questions for the Q&A, please use the Q&A button. Additionally, we're recording today's talk, and we're going to put this on our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to rewatch it or share it with a friend, you can do so. And you'll also find other public programs on our channel and other information. But without taking any more time, I'm going to pass this over to Jamie Allen, and she can take us away.
Thanks, Emma. And thanks to so many of our friends of the museum and our family members, I think from both of us online today are really lovely to see everybody's names in that chat. And Bruno, I see you. I see your chat message that's saying, doesn't that mean it's the 76th anniversary of the museum? The museum opened to the public on November 9th, oh my goodness, now the number's gone, 49. And so that makes last November our 75th anniversary. And we're taking this whole year to celebrate our anniversary. The museum was founded prior to that, so we do have a longer history than that, but it was founded in 1947, but we opened the doors in 1949, and we're taking that as our moment of, that's when we started sharing photography and moving images with folks around us and really thinking about these technologies as the wondrous things that they are. And get my screen going here. So the first thing I wanted to talk about as we think about how this exhibition came into being, it's a little bit of a behind the scenes in this talk, but as well I'm going to highlight some of the things in the exhibition that I love or that I was surprised by myself that my colleagues selected. But really this was a team effort. The entire curatorial team in the Department of Photography worked together to make this exhibition happen. It's in 7 sections, and so within the exhibition itself, while we each kind of talked to each other about the sections we were working on or collaborated on specific sections, there's a little bit of ownership on each of those sections from our team as well, individually as well as holistically. So I just want to acknowledge Phil Taylor, Daniel Peacock, and Louis Chavez, who really were such wonderful collaborators on this endeavor. And just to give you an idea of what it is that I say when I say that we curated or organize this exhibition. That takes us from selecting which objects in our vault. We go into the vault, we find the object that we want, that we think we should show, working with our framing department to think about how it should be matted and framed, working with our conservation department in case something needs to be worked on that object, thinking about the layout of the exhibition and how visitors are going to receive those objects, how they're going to be interpreted with text and different kinds of didactics on the wall, all the way to when things are coming into the gallery, we're there physically moving them 2 inches to the left or right with our prep team, trying to make the exhibition look as beautiful as we possibly can. And in this case, I think we were really able to transform the galleries. Just to give you an idea, for the most part, this is a relatively new team to our institution. Phil's been at the museum for about 3 years, and Daniel and Louis have been at the museum for about 1.5 years. So it was really fantastic to see new eyes on the collection. I've been here this will be my 18th year now. And so thinking about how we can bring out things that maybe we've never seen before, that haven't been seen in a long time, or just new highlights that excite people who are working in photography history today, has been really wonderful. Of course, the main goal of the exhibition is to celebrate our opening in 1949, and that's 75 years of history. And in some cases, we looked at significant exhibitions in our history and picked objects that were in those significant exhibitions, but we're not necessarily nodding to that within the show. We're just kind of adding those to the mix and thinking about what it is that the history of curators here have done to interpret this collection and build this collection as well. The second main goal was to display important objects from our collection. And so when I thought about that, first thing that came to mind for me was this portrait of Louis-Jacques Daguerre. Daguerre was one of the inventors of photography, and this is a daguerreotype of him. It's the process he invented, and it's a portrait of him by Sabatier-Blot. And it's just really wonderful to have this thing where you can see this individual who was one of the inventors of photography so prominent in this picture. There's only about 10 extant images of Daguerre in the world that we know of. And so to have one in our collection that's also a daguerreotype is just really astounding. And it's a beautiful little gem of an object. So to just really bring out the things our collection is known for is what we wanted to do. Third goal was to address the many histories, and I'm going to repeat that. Yes, it's plural, histories of photography. This team of curators really believes that there's a lot of different histories of photography that come together to make this overarching what is now called the history of photography. And that might be that there's science, that there's photojournalism, that there's art, that there's all these different things that play within the medium. But that's also that a lot of different individuals have written histories of photography. They might be technical histories, they might be object-based histories, they might be documentary or, again, fine art based. So just kind of thinking about the different vantages that people have had on the histories of photography, and that any given object can really shift through a lot of those kinds of histories. So one of the things we wanted to do was include objects that weren't necessarily traditional art objects or weren't necessarily well known, but show the uses of photography. So in this case, this is a little lantern slide. It's only about 1.5 inches tall. And the photograph is that little thing in the middle. I'm going to use my cursor here for you. All right, so it's that little thing in the middle, and that is the Declaration of Independence in its entirety, about the size of a pinhead. Which is kind of amazing to think that photography was able to digest this massive amount of information into this little tiny thing that somebody could carry into their pocket, send in the mail, and show somebody else on a microscopic slide. But equally, photography shows us things that we can't see in a different way. In this way, it's blowing up the scales of a butterfly's wing. So we're really getting these details that our human eye is not going to have access to, right? This is not how our eyes see. We don't see in black and white. We don't see in this kind of macro vantage. So to think about the ways that photography really changes the way we view the world. The fourth main objective was to create new juxtapositions. that address photography from a contemporary perspective. And again, this kind of gets back to that histories of photography, but what is it that we can do today that showcases the things in our collection in new and different ways? And so those juxtapositions were really important to us. And one of the things that we did in the design of the exhibition was to make a very kind of porous design, right? There's lots of walls that are kind of floating in the middle of the floor. You can see between them. And what that does when you're visiting the exhibition is that it starts to combine objects in new and surprising ways. So you might get, for those folks who know these individuals, Gustave Le Gray, Paul Douce, Lindsay Addario, Anna Atkins, right? All in the same vantage, along with Candida Hofer, Lorna Simpson, right? So all of these different kinds of photography are combining. You get different ways of viewing things. And even though in the exhibition there's a section that you might be within, you still get these little inklings and tendrils of what's going on around it. And for us, that's very much like the history of photography. So a good example of that, if we think back to that little microscopic slide and the stereo view that I showed earlier, is this photograph by Uri Gersh, which is a contemporary photograph. It's not a small thing, like that lantern slide, it's about 8 feet tall. So this is in the exhibition currently, along with Betty Hahn's soft daguerreotype. But this photograph by Uri Gersh, I think, is really interesting. And again, how it shows us that photography can do things in ways that our eyes cannot see. And the first time I encountered Uri Gersh's work was at the Hirshhorn Museum. It was actually through a video. So I want to show you a clip of a video that he made. But this is an object. This is an object exploding. Some of you might already know that it's a vase of flowers, right? Very surprising to see this kind of destruction of something that we think of as so naturally beautiful. What he does is he takes that vase of flowers and encases it with liquid nitrogen, puts little explosive devices on it, and explodes it, and films it with a lot of different cameras and video equipment so that there's lots and lots of vantages and views of this event happening, right? You have to think of that as a totality of an event. So let me show you the video so you get a sense of what that looks like. So if you can imagine being in a gallery space where there's just a TV on the wall with that little bit of high-pitched sound, and you walk up to something and then it explodes, right? But you can see these petals falling. He's slowed it down so that you really have the ability to experience this event. I love this flower that falls in towards the end here. So thinking about this, showing just one still from an event like that really changes our perspective of that thing. You don't necessarily have access to what the thing is itself because the title doesn't give it away. Most people actually do end up arriving at, when they're standing in front of this thing, that it's a vase of flowers, that it's been exploded. So they get to those things on their own. And how are we doing that with our eyes and our knowledge and our senses? But if we think about what that vase of flowers looked like, it's very much like a painting. There's kind of a historic knowledge that he's drawing upon in the way that this view is set up. But with that, he's showing us something, again, that photography brings us that we can't see in any other way. And it's the beauty that's found in that destruction. One of the most difficult things to come up with when we're working on exhibitions is often a title. In this case, it's Life with Photographs. And it was inspired by this quote from Lucia Moholy. I was talking about how a lot of different people have written histories of photography. Lucia Moholy wrote one at that 100-year anniversary in 1939. I'm just going to emphasize that we're coming up in 14 years on 200 years of photography, which is kind of insane in my brain. But here's the quote: "Life without photographs is no longer imaginable. They pass before our eyes and awaken our interest. They pass through the atmosphere, unseen and unheard, over distances of thousands of miles. They are in our lives as our lives are in them. Right. So this idea of life without photographs really brought us to life with photographs. And here we are, an institution where we are intrinsically tied to the history of photography. Our life is with photographs. Every day I look at photographs, whether it be on my phone, on my computer, on the walls around me, whether it be on a billboard that I pass, right? Photographs are always in our lives, whether we recognize it or not. And really, we can't get away from them at this point. But also, what is it to have a photograph, and what is that photograph's life, and what is it doing as it travels through the world, and how did it get here, and what's our responsibility to it? So lots of things to do with how life and photographs tie together. So naturally, we started with before photography. My colleague Daniel Peacock put together a beautiful little section on objects that come from our collection, both our library and Department of Photography holdings, that showcase what we knew about photography before 1839, before that invention. The ways that we as a culture made images, the way that we thought about kind of images and capturing images in something like this. So in this case, this is one of those vantages where I just saw it everywhere when I was learning about the history of photography. This is a camera obscura. It's a diagram of it, right? I'm going to go ahead and go to the next page so you have the information about the book, but it's from 1645. And it's written by a Jesuit priest, and the title roughly translates to The Great Art of Light and Shadow, right? So if we go back to this camera obscura box, you have the person in the middle. There's a hole in the wall. There's actually a hole in both sides of this wall. And that picture is coming through, and it's showing that this light from this top of this thing is coming through and making the top of this image. So it's upside down and backwards, right? That's the basic idea of a camera. All you had to do to make photography possible was capture that image. And up until 1839, people had lots of ways of using camera obscuras. They used them to draw, they used them to paint, they used them just to observe the world, to frame things. So there's lots of ways that photographic technologies, as we think of them today, were already in kind of part of our culture. But what was amazing about this book when Daniel brought it out and I was looking at it is how it is not about photography, right? It's not about that at all. It's about light, and it's about shadow, and it's about the ways that minerals trick your eyes into thinking that there's something else. It's about phosphorescence. It's about all these other things rather than just photography. It's about light. And light is that basis of photography. So it was really fun to think about the context of the things that we feel are the basis of the history of photography, but what were they doing before that? Additionally, we have some really lovely kind of painted miniatures and silhouettes in our holdings that show how portraits would have been made prior to photography. These are small objects, both of these kind of small, intimate objects. You would have probably had some wealth if you were going to have something like this. It wasn't like everybody could have their silhouette or painted portrait made. So, you know, it shows a certain amount of class in your family and a certain amount of wealth, but really beautiful examples of these things. Now, as photography enters, these things don't necessarily end, right? There's a history that overlaps with photography in these objects, but these are all right around that same time period of the history of the beginning of photography. You'll remember I was talking about how folks use the camera obscura to make different kinds of things like drawings. And this is a drawing that we think is from around that same kind of invention of photography era. It's by Bouton. And it's the southeast view of the city of New York. But I don't know what your view looks like on your computers or phones, but it's very small lines, very sketchy. You know, it has a few kind of trees that you can see happening, a few tall church steeples and buildings happening, but there's not any shadow. There's not any detail. It's just a sketch that then they would have had to go back and use their minds to kind of reinvent what was filling it in if they wanted to do more. So this is the device that they would have used to make something like that. This is a smallish one, but this is from our collection. It's a sliding box camera obscura. What it does is this piece on the back opens up on this one. You can see, then you put your piece of kind of transparent paper on a ground glass that's in there. The lens projects the thing up onto there, and then you can trace it. Seems pretty simple, but you can see the result, right? Not as clear as something like a photograph. And that was actually one of the things that really frustrated William Henry Fox Talbot. And I'm going to clarify, this is not a portrait of William Henry Fox Talbot. This is a portrait of Gillian Wearing as Talbot, the artist Gillian Wearing. But I love that this is just feet away from this other drawing. It really makes me think about how frustrated Talbot was with these technologies. And that was his impetus for inventing the form of photography that he did. He wanted to be able to capture this photograph, capture this image on a piece of paper, and get rid of that whole having to interpret it. He didn't feel he was a very good artist. So that was his impetus for inventing photography. So here's, again, that sketch. And I'm going to show you next a daguerreotype, which is from around the same era. And I really want you to think about the difference in the detail that you're seeing. So as I said, the exhibition's divided into different sections. There's a section called Expansive Documentary that Luis Chavez and I collaborated on. And in this case, this is another one of those objects that our collection is just kind of known for that we wanted to be sure to include. We have many very early daguerreotypes in our holdings, mostly from America and Europe, or Europeans and Americans that were traveling to other spaces. And in this case, this is a photograph taken in Japan. I'm going to kind of blow it up for you because the detail on this is pretty amazing. These are the graves of American soldiers who had died there. Presumably, the photographer made this image to bring it back so that their loved ones could see where they were entombed. But I'm going to point out on the screen here, there's a person in this scene, right? And that's pretty common in painting and photography that we put a person in for scale in the landscape. But it really gives you an idea in the sense of the scale of this space when you notice that person. And you can really get a good sense of the detail of the space as well. The lenses weren't really clear at this time, so you can see the edge is a little bit fuzzy. Oh, accidentally pushed the button. But for the most part, a really good sense of this place where most people would not have been able to visit. In that same section, there's this photograph by Lindsay Addario. And this is actually one of the newest acquisitions to our holdings. I was excited that we were able to get 5 of Addario's works last year. In this case, this is a photograph that takes place in Afghanistan. And what I love about Addario's work and her speaking in her interpretation about her own work is that she talks about kind of the morals and the ethics of being a photojournalist. So in this case, it really helps to know the situation. If you were in the exhibition, it would be there on the label for you, but I'm going to give you a little bit more. So here, she and her interpreter were driving through Afghanistan in a very remote area, and they see these unaccompanied women. And you very seldom see any unaccompanied women in Afghanistan. They soon discover that the woman in the back is named Nornisha, and that she's 18 years old and that she's pregnant. In fact, by the time this image was made, her water had already broken. Her husband, whose first wife had died in childbirth, was determined that he would get his second wife to the hospital, but it was a 4-hour drive from the village where they lived in. And as they were driving, the car broke down. And so he went and searched for another vehicle and left her and her mother here in the desert, kind of waiting for him to come back. Now, naturally, Addario and her interpreter said, "Get in the car, we'll take you to the hospital." But because these women didn't have her husband's permission, they weren't able to get into the car. So the interpreter actually went out and found the husband, brought him back. He gave permission for these folks to get in the car. They all went to the hospital. The story ends really well. But Addario realizes that she has become part of the situation, right? So after making this initial image of these women as she kind of discovered them, she stops photographing that story because she is part of it and she's changing that story and she recognizes that. So it's a little bit of that, as a photojournalist, you're supposed to have this kind of, non-view. You're just kind of a lens looking at the world, but you also have to have compassion for your subject. And when do you choose to have compassion, and when can you have compassion for those folks and intervene in their lives? So in the installation, this photograph is next to a kind of a large display of other documentary photographs, and they're very diverse. It goes from Peter Mugabane, Donna Ferrado, Larry Clark, Harry S. Wong, Henri Cartier-Bresson, Mary Ellen Mark, Miriam Post-Walcott, Rita Leisner, and Graciela Iturbide, right? So we're trying to show kind of views from all over, and also maybe surprising things. Like most people probably don't think about Mary Ellen Mark's Falkland Road series when they think of her work. They probably think of Tiny or something else. There's a really lovely image by Henri Cartier-Bresson that, while it's not the decisive moment he's known for, it really is a decisive moment in that post-World War II era. So thinking about, again, recontextualizing these things and kind of mashing up very contemporary things with historic things. Also in this section is this work by Dawoud Bey, which commemorates the 16th Street Baptist church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 girls and 2 boys were killed in related events. So the 4 girls were killed in the church bombing, and the 2 boys were killed in subsequent events as they were kind of chased down and shot on the street. In this series, Dawoud Bey is talking about this historical event, but he is coming back to it by photographing young people who were the same age as the victims, but in the contemporary sense, and people who would have been the same age as those victims had they not died that day. So pairing these mashups of kind of the youth and the elder and thinking about kind of that moment in time through these portraits. It's a series of portraits. This happens to be the one that's in our collection. But I love that they both kind of project this resistance and passion and love, and that you get this sense of really thinking about that historical moment through these. So maybe not traditionally a documentary photograph, but for Louis and I, we were thinking about ways that photography talks about historical moments and documents the world around us, but through even art. Another good example of that is this Hiromi Toshida print, which is called Lunchbox. And it's a really beautiful print, and I just love the sense of this object. But most people don't notice at first this text at the bottom because it's really small when you encounter it in person. And so I want to read that text for you. It's a Reiko Watanabe, 15 at the time, was doing fire prevention work under the student mobilization order at a place 500 meters from the hypocenter. Her lunchbox was found by school authorities under a fallen mud wall. Its contents of boiled peas and rice, a rare feast at the time, were completely carbonized. Her body was not found. So even though we approach this thing and we have very little context for what it's about from the title and the date, 1982, we realize that this becomes about the bombings that happened to end World War II in Japan, and really thinking about Nagasaki and those spaces where thousands of people's lives were affected, and how this is the remnants of that. So in this case, Toshida is going into archives and finding these objects and documenting them and bringing them back out and telling these stories. And that, again, is the power of photography, is that it can go and find these things and bring them to us even though we can't go see them. And in this case, we really have an empathy and sympathy for the subject of the photograph, and thus that historical moment as well. The next section I want to talk about is called Structures of Knowledge. It's a section that Daniel Peacock and Phil Taylor worked together on. And all I have on this slide is the word lightning. And that's because I want you to think about, what does lightning look like? If you had to draw a picture, if you had to describe it to somebody, how would you do that? We have this lovely little object in our collection by William Jennings. And he actually starts it off with his picture of what lightning looks like, according to artists, right? It's that lightning bolt effect. But what he does is he's actually able to take photographs of lightning, and it's really the first photographs of lightning. And he shows that lightning doesn't look like a lightning bolt at all. It's very diverse in how it comes into being. So again, photography showing us the world around us in new ways that maybe we had never seen, or we never stopped to think about the ways we portray the world and the way it actually is. Another favorite object from our collection is this book by James Hall Naismith and James Carpenter, and it's called The Moon Considered as a Planet, a World, and a Satellite. And really what they're trying to do is establish that the moon was formed by volcanoes. And so they start off with this idea of a crater, Vesuvius, that they've built. And the smoke coming out of that is actually fingerprints when you look at the photograph, right? So they've actually made those fingerprints happen to make it look like that crater is smoking. Also in this album are pictures of the back of the hand or an apple that's shrinking so that they can think about the way that something kind of shrinks in and forms over time. So they're doing all these comparisons through photography. But the majority of the images in the book are more like this, where you're looking at the surface of the moon. But what is remarkable is at that moment in time, 1874, they wouldn't have been able to make a photograph like this through a telescope of the moon. So what they actually did was they made a paper mache model, photographed that, and presented it as the moon. And so a lot of people came to think this is what the moon's surface looked like. They didn't realize necessarily that there was that intermediary step of a paper mache model. And so there's a falsity to photographs, right? There's a truth and a falsity as well. This photograph actually goes on. A researcher was here recently telling me that they've seen a lantern slide from as late as the 1920s that presents this as a photograph of the moon, right? So even though we know it to be false today, this was something that people used to educate themselves. Contemporary photographers and artists like to play with this idea, that fact and fiction of photography. And one of my favorite series, which Phil and Daniel included, was this series by Patrick Nagatani, where he takes on this character called Ryuichi, who is a scientist and an explorer, and he's really going around digging and these sites around the world, so Stonehenge and the Grand Canyon and different places like that. In this case, he's in Jaya Singh Observatory in India. And here's a picture of what that looks like today. It's one of the oldest observatories in the world. It was built in 1724. But if you notice in Nagatani's photograph, Ryuichi's found a car there, right? He's found a Jaguar, which is kind of remarkable to think about. But that's kind of the point of his work, is that he's playing on these things. And I've seen multiple people come up to some of these photographs and be like, how is there a car underneath Stonehenge? And they don't really realize that he has constructed this scene. It's actually little miniatures that he's constructed and made to look like that. So it's kind of a fun series, but it really brings into that question of how truthful is photography, even when it's a document of something. Which is a great segue into something like Bertillon's photograph, where they're looking at forensic photography, right? And it's got an appendix on anthropomorphic classification and identification, is what the title is telling you there. But in this case, they are showing the same person. And as you flip through the photographic album, this book about how to think about forensic photography, they're trying to show that somebody's eyes are really the main characteristic that's going to help you know that you're looking at the same person. And they do this by pasting two photographs in, which I'll show you here in a moment, and then cutting out above them so that all you're seeing is that person's eyes and nose. So it's a nice surprise when you see it. We luckily have two versions of this album, so we can put them side by side so you get both vantages in the exhibition. But it's really a fascinating way that people were trying to use photography to be able to show, that a criminal had come back again after being found out before, or as we think about portraiture and the section backdrops, which Phil Taylor put together, the way that we use photography to document criminality and to think about the ways that we ID people through photography. So that in this case, Fort Wayne, Indiana Police Department had all these mug shots of folks and described them. And then if somebody were to come back in, they'd be able to look through those and try to see if they were a repeat offender. Phil also included some really surprising things. And in this case, Southworth and Hawes is one of the biggest collections that we hold. It's one of the things we're known for. But this one is a really surprising one. It's a little tiny 6th plate. And it's got this man who's been basically wiped out of the photograph. I'm going to show you a second slide here where you'd see more of what it would have been looked like. So if it would have been over matted, you can kind of see that edge of the mat coming around. You'd get a lot less of this person. But why? Why is he being taken out of the photograph? There's this whole history of what people call hidden mothers in photography, where we see people's hands, arms, we see women draped in pieces of textile with a child sitting on their lap, where we see people basically posing with the child to help them have more comfort. But in this case, it just begs the question, why? Why did they erase this person from the photograph? Another section, another piece in this section is by Milton Rogovin, and it's actually a set of 3 photographs. In this case, it's a mother and child seen in 1973, 1985, and 1992. And what I love about Rogovin's series is he goes back into this neighborhood in Buffalo where he's from. He's an eye doctor, but his pastime is this photography and going back and finding people that he's already photographed and redocumenting them, and then making these series of images where we really get a sense of these people over time. Now in the exhibition, this photograph, these 3 photographs are next to this other one by a relatively well-known photographer named Diane Arbus. Now, if we're in a portrait section, why is there no person in this photograph? One might ask. But I think this was a really smart pairing that Phil did, because I love how this photograph really makes me see all the details of the room. So that when I approach this Milton Rogovin photograph, the set of Milton Rogovin photographs, I really noticed the details in the room. I noticed that the couches in this image on the right are coated in plastic. I noticed there's cowboy boots and heels, that their shoes, have kind of grown with them over time. That there's these plates and this photograph on the wall. And as I had the privilege of zooming in on these plates, after I looked at these in the exhibition, I came back to my computer and blew up the image really big. And they're actually plates commemorating the birth of children. And so one of them you can pretty much pair up with this boy that's in the photograph. And the other one, which is currently, which is on the right in the image on the left. So there's the boy's plate and the girl's plate. And this girl's plate actually shows that there's another child who's a little bit, I believe, younger than the boy. And so it begs the question, where is this little girl? When we get to this second image many years later, we only have the boy's plate. The portrait of the man in the military has disappeared and has been replaced by a baby's portrait. There's a calendar on the wall. So you can really see how this family's space has changed over time and what's become important to them or what they're no longer commemorating. Another section is called photo groups, and we were really thinking about how it's somehow in photography, it's natural for people to come together and critique their photographs or talk about photography or make photographs in collaboration with each other. There's always all these ways that people group themselves. And so Luis Chavez took on making a section that features 5 different, what we would call photographic groups from our collection. In this case, we're looking at photographic amateurs who love to gather. They love to send things through the mail. A lot of the photo technology companies and the ones that would make paper and different materials for photographers would actually help these folks come together, and they'd send each other photographs in the mail. We have these beautiful envelopes where people have critiqued each photograph and then sent it on to the next member of the club. So here they are posing with their cameras. I just want to call out in this section, just again, how wonderful the space looks, and thank our object preparators. You can see they've done a lot of work in building different kinds of mounts for the books in this case, for the different objects in this case. We have transparent objects, so things that are very difficult to show, daguerreotypes in cases, as well as we did a lot of groupings on the wall, which is a lot of work. So shout out to them here for the wonderful work they did and the collaboration. Also in this photo group section is an example of the photo session, and that's the, I'll just go back for a moment, the 4 slides you see on the shorter wall in this image. Here's 2 of those. Now, if we think about the photo secession movement, they're really looking at how to see the world through a mechanical device in ways that painting and drawing and other forms of art are doing. So I like to think that their photographs are just an extension of what's happening in the art world at that time. If you think about Impressionism and some of those kinds of movements. We have Gertrude Kaysebier here on the left with a photograph of Clarence White, who's another photographer from that same group. Again, they come together, they convene, they meet. So really, they do a lot of photographing of each other and his family. And I love the way that she's used the light in this image to really emphasize this woman's profile on the right-hand side as it comes through this newspaper that Clarence White is reading, the way his son is silhouetted in the doorway, and the other sons in their kind of military costumes are posed looking back. So there's really an emphasis on what's going on in the center of this image as he forms, or sorry, as Gertrude Kaysebier forms this composition. Another very well-known image from our collection is this photograph by Alfred Stieglitz called Sunrays, Paula Berlin. And it's a gelatin silver print of this object. But again, just the use of light, the repetition of all of her portraits up here on the wall, it's just a really beautiful example of what that group was doing. Now, we also included the New Topographics group in this, and that is because our institution put together, William Jenkins put together the exhibition New Topographics, Man-Altered Landscapes in 1957, or sorry, 1975, got those numbers reversed. And in this case, he brought together these photographers, but now in the history of photography, they are always together, right? So folks who may not have necessarily known each other or liked what each other were doing are now intrinsically tied together because they were in this very well-known photography exhibition. So we went ahead and made them a group to kind of emphasize the role that our institution has played on that history. Another section, I think we have 2 to go here, is Languages of Form. Languages of Form was one that Phil Taylor worked on, and it's really looking at art photography more specifically, and how photography is very formalist in composition and light and the way that people structure their images. And this beautiful image by Edward Weston of the photographer and artist Tina Modotti reciting poetry. I love that she's kind of caught in mid-recitation, and you have that moment of her passion for whatever it is that she's reciting. Now, again, this image is included on a wall of other things. I'm going to kind of circle it out here for you. It's got all kinds of different photographers on that wall, more contemporary ones on the adjacent wall. But again, because of the porousness of the exhibition, you also see photographs behind it from other sections. Again, this Edward Baldus, there's a Sing Quan Chi back here. And those could have equally been in this art form, kind of languages of form section. So thinking about, again, how photographs can really shift and are slippery in the way that they are interpreted in the histories of photography. Phil included this really beautiful image by Daido Moriyama. He's a 1970s Japanese photographer working in that 1970s scene. That scene was very much about new ways of seeing the world through photography. And here in those reflections, that street photography kind of way of seeing the world, you see his reflection, even though you don't necessarily get it, this woman's profile, you have both what's behind you and in front of you and next to you. All these things smashed together in the way that we get to see the world through photography. Now, this was very popular kind of in that photographic scene in Japan in the 70s. Toshio Shibata was kind of working against that scene. He was very influenced by the photographs of Ansel Adams and Edward Weston and other Western photographers, American West photographers, as he was working on his images and really thinking about the harmony between natural and man-made things. So again, new topographics, right? Is that kind of harmony between nature and man-made things, or in their case, the non-harmony between those things. But here we have a scene where you're looking at kind of very structured blocks. They almost look like salt crystals or something like that in the water here. You can see that there's a very strict line, and you don't know exactly what is nature and what is man-made, but you have a sense that a lot of the elements aren't necessarily natural because of how precise they are in terms of being a rectangle or being lined up in the water. So there's really something else going on. And it really engages you in this photograph. In addition, the angle of this photograph is really oblique, and you're really kind of up above something, so it flattens it out, which photography is great at. So it really gives you a different vantage as you look at that. Poetic image. Here's an example, a couple photographs down in the exhibition of Carleton Watkins, and this is from 1870, so over 100 years earlier than Shibata's image of Lassen Peak. And this, in this case, we're looking at something that is really foreign to our eyes in the sense that it looks otherworldly, even though it's within our own landscape. Also in that section is this photograph by Gustave Le Gray, which is a combination print. It's actually two different negatives. Photography wouldn't have been able to see the sea and the sky at the same time. So here we have a photograph where he's mashing those things together. And just like some of the photographs we were talking about earlier in the structures of knowledge section, where you have kind of this falsity to photography, it's also bringing a reality to photography, because even though this isn't what the camera could see, it is what his eye could see. He could see the clouds and the water at the same time. So through this photograph, making that happen. Just have a few more slides to go. The last section is called Questioning Photography, and it's actually in the exhibition right next to the pre-photography section, because we really wanted to think about that pre and post photography and what it is that photographers are doing in a contemporary sense, in a post-photographic world, to talk about and comment on what photography is. So this photograph by Alison Rossiter, you might originally think is a landscape, but it's actually just a piece of photographic paper, and the chemistry and the light that she shined on it and poured on it in the darkroom to make this image. It's very basic, looking at how the characteristics and the products and the language of the medium really come into being. And so there's quite a few things in the exhibition that talk about that. Just joke on the word flash, show images of rooms as camera obscuras, or in this case, use photographic papers and mediums to make beautiful objects. Another object that we put in was this photographic series by John Baldessari. It's a portfolio from our library. It's called Throwing Three Balls in the Air to Get a Straight Line. And if you think that's an absurd idea, that's great, because it is an absurd idea to try to throw three balls into the air and use your camera to capture them in a straight line. He gets pretty good. Although it's called Best of 36 Attempts, there's only 12 items in the portfolio itself, and we're only showing 8. So there's a selection that's being made there. And that's really fun to see that he's kind of successful. And I love when the trees enter in or when they aren't there. But this is really about contemporary art practice and capturing performance and documenting performance art as a concept and using photography to do that. So really how photography is going to become conceptual art. This is a inkjet print by Jonathan Lewis photograph that he made in the computer. And maybe it looks familiar to you, maybe not. Some of you might be familiar that there were once a thing called LPs, long play albums, maybe a popular group that was known. I have equally had people come into the exhibition and have no idea what this thing was. But it is, in fact, the album cover of Yellow Submarine, right? So Jonathan Lewis is thinking about the production of images and the consumption of images, and how as a collection of collective memories that we all have together, that our visual memories remember these things. So a lot of people who are very familiar with Yellow Submarine can come up with this is what this is an interpretation of. But again, this is 2003, so still kind of early digital. People are thinking about pixels. They're thinking about the way that digital photography is breaking up the world. And so he's really using that to comment on this idea of visual memory in modern communication. The last object I'm going to show you today is this Cory Arcangel work. And I think the number one question around this work is this a photograph? Why would you put that in your collection? But it's a chromogenic development print. It's a plain old color photograph. So it seems like it would be a photograph if it is on photographic paper, right? But all of this photograph is around the code that Cory Arcangel wrote that would make this gradient happen in Photoshop. And so here, that's the title. Presumably, if you put that into the computer, you'd get this image. He gave us instructions on how to print it and frame it and showcase it in the way that would have been popular in 2015 among photographic artists. So it's very much of that moment. But this is a photograph if it started off in the computer and was completely imaginary. We don't know. Or I do, I think it is. Anyway, thank you for listening today. Life of Photographs is up through August of this year, and hopefully some of you can come and see it. I'm going to look at the questions now, and Emma's going to help moderate too.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That was really wonderful. We do have a couple minutes left, so if anybody has a few questions or any questions at all, please pop them in the Q&A. I did see one come in a little bit earlier on in the presentation, Jamie, and it's from Bruno. He asks, isn't Gerst's work an extension of, forgive my pronunciation, Jean Méliès from 1904 to 1984?
You know, Bruno, I don't have that in my head right now, so I can't really answer that question, but I will have to look into that for certain. I know that Gerst definitely draws upon a lot of different things happening in photographic and film history, so I'm sure that's probably correct.
All right, we have another comment that came in. Another one of our friends at the museum, Tim. He says, I found a program from a 1992 Eastman exhibit that was similar called Masterworks from the collection. When I walked through the exhibit this year, I found only one artifact, a carte de visite sheet, that overlapped. Certainly it highlights how large and diverse this collection is.
Yeah, and that is really one of the difficulties, Tim, that we had in making this exhibition, right? We have what we estimate, we still don't have a solid number, but about 500,000 photographs in the Department of Photography alone, not including other departments in our institution. Every department here holds photographs. So really thinking about what it is that any one group of person pulls that, or sorry, one group of people or an individual pulls out of this collection over the course of time highlights something totally different. And so again, the goal of our group this time was to really bring out some surprises for people, things that people may not have identified with our collection, but also some of the best ofs that maybe haven't come out in a long time or have never come out.
Thank you, Jamie. A really good question and a plug for some upcoming programs happening on site at the museum. It was asked, you have 3 in-person tours of this exhibition coming up, which is true. How does one know which photos are covered in each tour?
Yeah, so we've been trying to say which sections we're going to cover in the tour. So the first tour I gave already was just the first room, just the pre-photography and post-photography kind of eras, sections of the space. The one that's coming up, not this Saturday, not tomorrow, but next week, is going to focus on language of forms. But I'll branch out into other sections. As you notice, there's kind of tendrils throughout the exhibition. So we'll branch out into some other sections and talk about photography as art or as form, and how those kinds of pieces of interpretation happen. The other 2 that are coming up will be focused on 2 of the other sections. One will be on structures of knowledge and backdrops, so kind of the knowledge and portraiture sections, and one will be on the groups and documentary sections. And so I think in our advertising, we'll try to be sure to say that.
Yes. Yeah. So check back for the website and we'll be as descriptive as possible. Excuse me, there and on our social media pages and in our members bulletin. We have another question. How many items in the exhibition will be changed during the show?
In this case, none. We're able to leave all of these up for the entire run of the exhibition. We don't often keep some of these kinds of things up past 6 months. You'll see a couple of spaces where there might be very low light, or there's a photograph that has a curtain over it to help protect it from light so that we can show it for that length of time. But in this case, everything is going to stay up the entire time.
All right. And potentially our last question for today, could you explain how were the 7 topics articulated and how do they relate to the 75 years of the exhibition?
So the 7 topics that we came up with, I think, as the group of us were working together, and it really started with Phil and I in collaboration and thinking about those important objects. And so we were both making groups of things that we thought needed to be shown, as well as trying to think about ways to contextualize the show, because a straight chronology of photography was not what we wanted to produce. And that gets to this kind of contemporary thinking on photography. How can photography be discussed? And this idea of mashing up contemporary and historic images into one space so that they're in conversations in new ways. And so as we were looking at those things, we started to see patterns arise. We saw that there was portraiture. We saw that there were things that kind of commented on photography and photographic language itself. We saw that there was documentary, which are all pretty basic if you think about the history of photography. There's art, documentary, science, and portraiture, right? So the main kind of 4 sections in there kind of address those. But all of those come out of some sort of lineage of our collection and our history and what we've shown here at the institution. So thinking through, we showed Electroworks, which was the first exhibition of Xerox photography. So we wanted to include something from that, right? And how important that is in the kind of history of our personal institution, but also in the history of photography, that xerography starts to be considered as photography. So the 7 sections came out of that, as well as us thinking about this idea of pre and post photography, and then groups and photography groups and how people come together in community.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And that's the time that we have for today. But anyone that might have lingering questions that come up as you start to think more about this presentation, you can send your emails to info@eastman.org, and that will be directed to the right person who can help you answer your questions. So I encourage you all to do that if you have more thoughts coming up. But Jamie, I want to thank you again. Thank you so much for giving us a wonderful walkthrough of the exhibition. I do encourage you all to come join us, whether it be for a curator-led tour or just to self-guide through the exhibition. You have quite a few months to go.
Or if you can't come and join us here on site, join us online through our virtual programs.
Yes. And thank you all for spending your afternoon with us. We really appreciate you and we hope you join us again. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.